Hello, everyone. We're going to try to get started, so please take your seat. I'm Sylvia Yunt. I'm the Chief Curator and the Cochrane Curator of American Art at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, and I'm very pleased to help kick off the first regular session of the 11th Annual AAMC Conference with this topical panel on shifting collection boundaries. And I think, could we have the lights down a little bit? Start with some images. With so many of us involved these days in expansions and reinstallations, it seemed the right time to explore how different museums are using these experiences to rethink old practices as well as collection taxonomies. And here are historical and contemporary images of my home base, the Virginia Museum, where our original 1936 Georgian Revival structure is now joined at the hip, literally, by the 2010 award-winning Rick Mather-designed McLaughlin Wing, a truly transformative expansion for our institution on many different levels. In encyclopedic museums, where objects are traditionally grouped by culture and period, and permanent divisions of artists by race, ethnicity, and gender are, for the most part, resisted, other factors have shaped the categorization of collections from the constraints of curatorial and registrarial oversight to donor restrictions. Yet within this larger cultural context, parameters of chronology and media are becoming less fixed, particularly in terms of collection and exhibition development, gallery display, and curatorial responsibility. Cross-departmental collection mixings and thoughtful adjacencies are no longer novel, as many museums attempt to provide alternative gallery narratives to the traditional canon by emphasizing more global and hybrid perspectives for our diverse audiences. For example, this mashup of the Virginia Museum's Edwin Lord Weeks and a contemporaneous Italian pavilion doesn't reflect an actual display. The painting actually hangs directly below the architecture, just one floor below. But it reveals a new form of gallery conversations we're offering the public, one that has dramatically changed over VMFA's 75-year history, as seen in the other image at top. I should also point out the relevant John Ravenel commissioned painting by Ryan McGinnis that hangs in our entryway and features objects from across the museum's 9 collecting areas, a point that resonates with our keynote conversation we've just heard. Significantly, older academic paradigms that have traditionally shaped curatorial practice are increasingly untenable for the 21st century museum. Think of the classic 1945 divide in American art, or the separation of decorative arts and design from the fine arts of painting, sculpture, and works on paper. So once again, we look to the Academy and its now more expansive embrace of a broadly defined visual culture in an effort to better engage and educate our visitors, who I think it's fair to say have little concern with such time-honored collection boundaries. Today, 3 esteemed colleagues with different institutional perspectives will discuss these experiences with these issues as both opportunities and challenges. We'll begin with Emily Bellou-Neff, Curator of American Paintings and Sculpture at the Museum of Fine Arts, Houston, whose thoughtful email query to fellow Americanists last August directly inspired this panel idea. Next will be Matthew Witkowski, Curator and Chair of the Art Institute of Chicago's Department of Photography, who previously worked at the National Gallery of Art and the Philadelphia Museum of Art, followed by Marla Burns, Director of UCLA's Fowler Museum, where she also does a fair bit of curating, as well as serving as adjunct assistant professor in the university's art history department, so I think bringing some very different experiences and perspectives together. After we hear from each of our panelists, we'll expand the discussion to include all of you, so please hold your questions until that point. So let's begin with Emily. And you just hit close out. Let's see, you're done.
Okay, good. Thank you, Sylvia. And I know that we're a little bit pressed for time, so I'm going to try to speak quickly, but I do want to say a quick shout out of thanks to Sylvia, of course, and to others who helped provide images and information as I put my thoughts together: Kathy Foster, Timothy Burgard, Margie Conrads, Olivier Melee, Heather McDonald, Heather Lammers, and at my own institution, Gary Tinero and Mari Carmen Ramirez, the latter the museum's curator of Latin American and Latino art and director of the ICAA, or International Center for the Arts of the Americas. And Mari Carmen always uses this image in her presentation, so I took a tip from her. This is a work by the Chilean contemporary artist, some of you may remember it, Alfredo Jar, and it was a public intervention in 1987 in Times Square, and it reminds us, especially those of us who are called quote-unquote Americanists, and this is the title that describes our curatorial purview in USA museums, Art of the USA, and in the 18th century Art of the British North American Colonies. But this image, I think, reminds us of the US tendency to erase half a continent, and at the same time, I think it suggests a more expansive and elastic notion of America, a subject I'll get to in just a moment. So as the MFA continues to grow and expand, and I'm showing you our campus, the Law Building, the Beck Building, the Cullen Sculpture Garden, we have 2 house museums, one for American decorative arts at Bio Bend, one for European decorative arts at Rienzi. And many of you know that we are embarking on a 3rd building dedicated to contemporary art. And so we find ourselves, like many of you, rethinking taxonomy. And I remember in the early 1990s when I was ABD and recently hired by our late director, Peter Marzio, to be the Americanist at the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. We formed a department in 1995, the first time there was a department devoted to American painting and sculpture at the museum, apart from Bio Bend, which opened in '66. And the late formation of the American Art Department always takes people by surprise because American art is so often considered old guard, but not so in Houston, where it's the 3rd youngest department at the museum after Latin American art and arts of the Islamic world. And I remember Peter and I were talking one day, and I remember mentioning to him that at the University of Texas at Austin, where I was part of the Center for the Study of Modernism, I was really an 18th century student of British and American art in the modern field, but that within the museum setting, I was called an Americanist. And the expression on Peter's face made it very clear to me that he had not hired an 18th century modernist, but an Americanist. And he knew that these terms, of course, were not mutually exclusive, but he also understood that museums are often conservative, they evolve slowly, and scaring away donors who specifically supported U.S. art by using language of the Academy was not going to go over too well. And just to give you a very quick example, one, I'm showing you 2 relatively recent acquisitions. On the right, a work by the Pennsylvania Colonial, Benjamin West, made as a presentation piece for King George III. It was supported by the group of American art trustees and supporters at the museum, although they did ask the question, is it American? And likewise, the image on the left by the French-born American Constant Meyer, who painted this monumental 8-foot Civil War scene, it too was likewise supported, although more than a few trustees deemed it too French. Now, this is in no way to be perceived as a criticism of the supportive and generous trustees with whom I work, but to point out a fact that may be true at many of the institutions where you work. Art of the U.S. tends to be collected and supported by Caucasians from generations shaped by the economic depression, World War II victory, and global dominance, and of course the construct of American exceptionalism that defined the field of American art at the time. Younger generations, of course, express more skepticism, recognizing the dangers of an extreme cultural nationalism, which we know too well, can lead to xenophobia, fascism, and other global problems. Now, I think my initial discomfort with the term Americanist is probably vestigial, a leftover concern about an outdated American exceptionalism that I just mentioned that dwelled on this question of what is American about American art, rather than we believed a much more interesting question of what kind of nation is being pictured or claimed if you wanted to go the identity route. But more importantly, what do we mean by America anyway in the phrase American art? Is it North America? Does it include Canada? Does it include the Southern Hemisphere? Art of the United States? And if the latter, how do you account for colonial art before there was a United States, which in the 1990s still referred to art of the British North American colonies, but more and more may also embrace the colonies of New Spain and the Southwest. And needless to say, there were plenty of innovative art traditions in the Americas long before Columbus and the rest of Europe arrived on American shores. At most institutions categorized as pre-Columbian and Native American art, which may or may not be integrated or in close proximity with pre- and post-colonial American galleries. Now, these are the kinds of questions that fascinate all of us, but it's terribly frustrating for registrars who have to constantly figure out where does an object live. I happen to be a proponent of the unstable home approach, which is that I actually really love the idea of American art having an unstable home. But that does mean a lot of bureaucratic problems. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with it, American art, the old American art, maybe I should say, which focused on the British North American colonies and moving forward colony to nation, is a field that grew from a variety of strands, including the colonial revival and antiquarianism, material culture, famously brought to Yale from Winter Tour by Jules Prown, and the inspiration and enthusiasm of the field's first PhDs, all of whom graduated from Harvard in the 1960s. And as Wanda Korn indicated in her 1988 State of the Field of American Art, which was in the Art Bulletin, American art had finally graduated from the children's to the adults table, and wow, didn't it feel good to be with the big boys, although I think she might have said something more along the lines that we were no longer the bastard stepchild of art history. In other words, it was all about legitimacy, and she was declaring the end of a search for legitimacy in the field of art history, even as the American art field itself was and continues to be, rightly so, I should think, for almost any field, in flux. For me, the most exciting change or shift in the field is the impact of Atlantic history on American art in the museum. And by American art, I mean art of the United States, colonial art of the British North American colonies, and the colonies of New Spain, although I'm entirely open to and anticipate an even more expansive definition in future. And to borrow Helen's phrase, potted history, to just give you a quick summary, we can say that instead of borrowing the more familiar historical framework of American history to provide perspective on the objects in our care, how the British North American colonies joined together to gain independence from an inept mother country, conducted a new political experiment in democracy, faced the challenges of democracy throughout the 19th and 20th century through, say, how the country resolved or tried to resolve the problems of westward expansion, slavery, racism, civil rights, women's rights, and so forth, we would adopt the model of Atlantic history, which focuses on the spatial, the Atlantic world of the 16th to the 19th centuries in Europe, North America, Latin America, the Caribbean, and West Africa, rather than the intellectual, the U.S. experiment in democracy and how that has played out over time. And the shift, of course, is the work of historical geographers like D.W. Meinig, who sees Atlantic history, as he calls it, a vast interaction among all continents with Atlantic shores, rather than the one-way transfer of Europeans and Africans onto American shores. So in the model of Atlantic history, if it plays a role in the museum, how does it work? Well, in some cases, it's simply in the institution's DNA. The superb Peabody Essex Museum that many of us visited last evening has nurtured a global perspective since its founding in 1799. The colonial, post-colonial, transoceanic, Asian, Native American, export art, and so forth, both integrate, collide, and bump up against one another, I think, in very fascinating ways. And sometimes an Atlanticist vision, or at least a more expansive American vision, is in the DNA of the collectors whose art became private museums open to the public. So, for example, Marion Coogler Mcnay lived in a city that felt its roots very deeply in San Antonio, to some degree Coltecan and Tonkawa, but for her, really more Spanish colonial, which she collected on summer trips to New Mexico. And likewise, I'm a hog of Biobend Collection and Gardens in Houston, like many of her contemporaries in 1920s and 30s believed that the only authentic American art was an indigenous one. And in 1931, as you see here, she integrated Pueblo ceramics with American glass, hooked rugs, Windsor furniture, and an image that provides a regional inflection of the colonial revival. So what is lost today, as we pigeonhole and more concisely define collection boundaries, is that broader and more complicated sense of American that collectors such as Miss Hogg and Mrs. Mcnay embraced rather than parsed. But what if an Atlanticist vision is not in an institution's DNA, as it is at the Peabody Essex, is just one example? What if it's imposed from without? And some of you may recall that Rick Bertel, former director of the Dallas Museum of Art, ruffled feathers when he conceived the Museum of Americas in the Nancy and Jake L. Hammond Wing at Dallas, which opened in 1993 and took a hemispheric approach to the art of the Americas from the Olmec through regionalism in the United States of the 1930s and 40s. And I'm told, and I'm sorry I've not been able to check this out, so I'm hoping someone will come forward and enlighten us. I'm told that Santa Barbara Museum of Art created an earlier version of this idea, but the DMA's, I think, was the first major effort to construct and organize inside out its collections using a geographically inclusive Americas approach. Sometimes it comes through the side door, so to speak, as it did at the De Young in San Francisco, where Timothy Burgard, then the curator of American art, received the transfer of Spanish colonial objects into the Department of American Art, and attentive to sense of place, San Francisco was once part of New Spain, combined, as he put it, ye olde New England with Native American and Spanish colonial objects, as you see here. Further south, in Los Angeles, LACMA has its own Department of Latin American Art, which embraces Spanish colonial, but remains distinct from the Department of the Art of the United States. And in a wonderful turn at the MFA Boston, the Art of the Americas wing, which includes, as you see here, these wonderful Mayan urns that greet you, pre-Columbian, Native American, and colonial New England, a new gallery focusing on the art of New Spain, and I'm showing you a spectacular portrait below by Miguel Cabrera of the Archbishop of Mexico. It provides a new window on a colonial world previously dominated by, and justifiably still celebrated, John Singleton Copley. Now in Houston, I made an unsuccessful attempt around 1995 when we were forming the department to bring in the world in which the museum now physically occupies, likewise once New Spain. And this new awareness for me and effort was inspired by my colleague at the museum, Jim Clifton, who had included the art of New Spain in a hugely successful exhibition called The Body of Christ. But we were engaged with providing a skeletal outline of U.S. art, beginning literally with Thomas Cole, and resources were limited and institutional priorities different. When the Department of Latin American and Latino Art was founded by Mari Carmen in 2001, along with the establishment of the ICA, which I mentioned, which focuses on Mexico, Central and South America, and the Caribbean, I believe that the time had come for this early material to come forward at our institution, but it was not to be. The very strict mandate of the Latin American Department and its key supporters was in the area of contemporary art. And so Mari Carmen and Michael Wellen are very, very supportive of this interest and will be helpful to the degree that they can, but bottom line, they cannot devote their departmental funds to it. With the help of a new donor, and of course, as we all know, that is always the key, we're making some progress. He's made available from his own collection a few liturgical objects to bookend the pre-Columbian art galleries, and we'll be including on upper left this really spectacular Virgin of Guadalupe by Jose de Alcibar in a forthcoming temporary installation of the permanent collection, in which it will appear with objects from Bayou Bend. And we'll also use this material in a temporary exhibition called American Adversaries West and Copley in a Transatlantic World. And we'll show the rest of these artworks that you see here from various institutions in conjunction with Copley's iconic Watson and the Shark, set in 18th century Cuba, including a major Costa painting from the Denver Art Museum, also by Jose de Alcibar, a Jean Racine of the West Indies by Agostino Brunjas, showing the division of race lines, focusing here on free women of color, and 2 paintings of blacks by Copley and Reynolds, all of these coming together to help show the fluidity and the anxiety of race in 18th century global encounters. And so while negotiating the loan of the Costa painting I showed you, I came to know Donna Pierce, who is the Frederick and Jan Mayer Curator of Spanish colonial art at the Denver Art Museum, the best collection of its kind in the country. And in the process we've been talking about for several years now, and we're finally pulling together a traveling exhibition on the subject of colonial New England and colonial New Spain, focusing on the similarities and differences among colonial cultures as a point of departure. Now, I think that these are admittedly small steps, especially in comparison to other institutions, but they are foundational stones that we hope will grow into something bigger for us, and the point is clear. Paradigm shifts do not occur through by the tearing down of a historical construct, but with the replacement of it. And so the impact of Atlantic history, I think, along with the energy and dynamism and resources that are devoted to the study of Latin American art now, may just be that it helps us bridge our borders, recover some sense of a more expansive America that is far less concerned about an East Coast, West Coast cultural axis, but one more fully informed by a North-South one. And now, Matthew Witkowski.
Sorry, I defected to Mac a few years ago, and of course have totally forgotten how to just see the slideshow. View? No. To my left? Sorry. Thank you. Or just this. I knew it was one of those. It just seems easier. It seems easier to look at one thing at a time, which is how I approach life in general. It's a very interesting session and a very interesting conference, I think, and I only wish that we had more time to pick apart some fundamental issues. But to state the obvious, at least to me, geography, chronology, and medium are the most common bases for defining departments at large museums anyway. And you know, as with all criteria for putting up boundaries, in some instances they make a lot of sense, and in some instances less sense, and in every instance, for all the collegiality that one could encounter, there are problems that will always arise when you try to cut across those, you know, the criteria that have been set up. The Department of Photography, I think, in a Department of Photography, I should say, at any larger museum can be a catalyst to shape these crosscuts, because it doesn't have really it doesn't have one of those three at all, geography, and that's not something new. In a naive way, big exhibitions like the Film and Photo Show that traveled across Germany and Zagreb in Japan in 1929, or much more famous, the Family of Man exhibition, were global, as I say, in some sort of unstudied way. And a mandate to collect, or at least the permission to collect across the world, has been with most photography departments for a long time, if only implicitly. And the chronology becomes ever broader, ironically, as the museum world, but I would also say the art world, including its academic side, constricts ever more toward the contemporary. So, for instance, in my department, Elizabeth Siegel, who wrote a dissertation on Victorian albums and recently curated a show on Timothy O'Sullivan, coming from the Nelson Atkins, so he's a and a Western expeditionary photographer of the 1850s and 60s, but she also presented a show on Uta Barth, of new work by Uta Barth, who's obviously a contemporary artist, and Kate Bassard, who launched a series of shows 6 years ago now to focus only on emerging artists, curated from the collections of the museum this exhibition, Souvenirs of the Barbizon, on the artists working in the forest of Fontainebleau. That kind of roaming around is very healthy, I think. I don't see it so much in other areas of our museum, given certain practical constraints, but I think it's good for the department. I think it's good for the museum. The criterion that's the biggest sticking point for photography is the one of medium, which is the one stated, constraint, but it's a very difficult one to define, and I'll say a little bit more about that as I go along here. But there have been many interdepartmental shows since I began 3 years and some months ago at the Art Institute. This was one of them, and there were etchings, photographs, and paintings in the exhibition. And the exhibition was prepared with active consultation with curators from what we have as medieval to modern, but there's a curator there for painting and sculpture of the 19th century in Europe, and with curators in the Department of Prints and Drawings. Here's another example of a multi-departmental exhibition, which, however, was also curated just by one person, me, based on a large acquisition that was made at the museum that I was able to make when I started, but which I very much pursued as a collegial multi-departmental effort, and there would have been no other way to do it responsibly. It was a collection of Central and Eastern European modernism assembled by a couple in New York, Robert and June Leibowitz, over a couple of decades, and the Leibowitzes were centered in the photographic, shall we say, but didn't see any particular reason to stop it when the story seemed to head in other directions. And so you see here, porcelainware that they bought, along with photographs of that porcelainware that was used to advertise it. You see, photolithographic posters. You see photographically illustrated, or much more than illustrated, really photo-driven magazines, I would say. And then in this case here's more deck arts, and in this case are artist books, including, for instance, an L. Lisitsky book, For the Voice, that has nothing, I'm sorry, A Tale of Two Squares. There's also For the Voice in there, which does have photographic elements minorly, and then this other L. Lisitsky work that doesn't have photography in it. So in fact, out of 1,000 pieces in the collection, only a couple dozen pieces came to my department. But I believed in very strongly, and in the message that such a show would send, that the photographic can be everywhere. There were two implicit points really in the show. One was that photography isn't a medium if we use a logical definition, which is a technical support and the conventions that surround the use of that support. There's no particular technical support, or there's such a range of them, and the conventions shift enormously. And in fact, to reach out to something that Helen Molesworth was getting at earlier, it's really more the breaks and the ruptures that define the history. And I think it's exciting to address breaks and ruptures within one department or one museum, but still recognizing that it's great shifts that make for exciting developments, at least in the modern era. And then, so I'm trying to remember what the other point is. Oh yes, that at key moments in history, what makes photography exciting is its convergence with other disciplines, in this case advertising, and to some degree theater and film especially. But literature is a big part of many shows that we do, and then sculpture and painting, and I'll show that in a second. So that, if I'm offering ambitiously, I guess, that a photography department can help rethink, what the term encyclopedic museum might mean, it would be because it is something that in its history incorporates a lot of rupture and breaking down of things in a lot of shifts, and because it's a naturally sort of an organically multidisciplinary field. But probably all the fields of art are. In fact, they certainly are. And so it wouldn't be that that would make photography exceptional. It might only make it, let's say, more blatantly normative. And then by working on that normativity, that's precisely how you could get to some larger understanding. But okay, in the couple of minutes that are left to me, I want to, because I know that we like to think about practical considerations here. You know, how do you make a big acquisition like that? The first and easiest thing about, I mean, the thing that made it easiest was that it was spurred by funds controlled by the director. So there wasn't a question of, you know, more coming from here, less coming in from here. All the departments that were concerned, and I approached all of them to see if they'd be interested. So that's architecture and design, prints and drawings, the library, and photography, all put up money and time. Photography, you know, drove the research and presentation of the acquisitions at different departmental meetings, to be sure. But everyone went out to look at the collection, and decisions were made. For instance, there were objects like Russian constructivist books that could easily have belonged to Prints and Drawings or in the library. Prints and Drawings claimed them. And, you know, these are discussions that you have on different things. There were photo montage, but all the posters, and we have never collected posters before this at the Art Institute. So all the posters went to Prints and Drawings as sort of the closest department, you know. And there were things